Rain was falling as James sat in his office. A cigarette was sitting in his fingers, and he suddenly had a sense of déjà vu. Isn't this where it started? Staring out at the rainy evening as cars drove mindlessly on, oblivious to the threat that was creeping up upon them. His fingers were twitching with anticipation, and he longed for action. An explosion, a shout, a phone call, something. Anything to break the silence in this endless agony of this peaceful atmosphere. Is this what they meant when they said ignorance was bliss? In his time as a police officer, James Troy had learned about the ugly underbelly of this world, and how often it was easy to overlook by the common man. The average citizen had no idea just what lay below the thin, fragile surface of the lie called civilization. Just under their noses lurked a threat very real, but to them was 100 miles across the ocean. A sane man might have wished not to know, to remain blissful about the truth. But James Troy was not a normal man anyway. He's glad he knew. It let him ponder his next moves. It had been half a week since he'd brought his evidence and complaints to the police, and of course, he'd been careful about his wording, and when he had shown them the photos of the U-boat, it certainly seemed to cause stirs, but none acted on anything. At most, he was told it was likely nothing, and they would look into it, and then he was hurried out. It was infuriating to know that the same department meant to protect the public from the underground monsters was trying its hardest to pretend the monsters weren't there. What had they come to? So frightened of a potential war that they'd willingly overlook an obvious threat? What would they do if Nazis began landing on the docks ready for armed combat? Would they cover their eyes and ears and pretend nothing was there? That seemed almost likely now. And what was he going to do now? The police weren't going to help. He couldn't go back to his apartment for fear of being followed, and then, of course, there was Elizabeth. As James watched raindrops fall down the glass of the window, the street lamps that caused the droplets to glitter almost appeared to shape her smile. Her beautiful eyes that dazzled like a night below the moon. He absent-mindedly found his hand slowly reaching out as if to touch her soft face, only to pause as a few droplets rolled along, distorting the face and reaffirming reality. You're a damned fool, James, he whispered to himself. He puffed his cigarette again and closed his eyes in lamentation. He wanted to call her at her apartment right now. Talk to her. Tell her what he really felt. That night they'd eaten together had been a dream, and he'd not once tried to act on the lucidness. He'd just stared at her and not done a thing. And yet with each glance at the phone, he turned his eyes away again. He couldn't drag her any further into this than she already was. But how to keep her safe and wage this underground war at the same time? Maybe he could convince her to leave town. She was a stubborn dame, but she might listen if he... James hadn't been expecting company. He turned around in his chair at the sound of the knocking. He set his half-used cigarette in the ashtray and sat up in his chair. Come in, he called. Wearing a soaking wet raincoat and an umbrella in his hand was a short, balding man with an angular face and a crooked nose like a bird beak. He had round spectacles that gave his plumper cheeks an odd upward shape. He had on a black suit under his coat, and in his other hand was a wet leather briefcase. He had a smile on his face that dripped with a sense of narcissism that James could potentially taste. James had met guys like this before, and they often had one thing in common: a sense of superiority that came from a position of public office. He was a politician, or at least he worked with one. "Can I help you?" James asked.
Good evening, Herr Troy."
His German accent suddenly sent a cold shiver up Troy's spine, and his hand instinctively started to move to his pistol in his desk.
"My name is Albert Hofstetter. I'm a representative of Herr Hans Heinrich Deckhoff."
Troy's lip curled a little into a sneer. Deckhoff was the diplomat of the United States from Germany. He'd send a toady to come and talk to him. Did Deckhoff know what was going on? A possibility. But maybe there was more to this guy than he let on. "And how can I help you, Hofstetter?" Troy asked darkly.
Herr Deckhoff was at a dinner with your police commissioner, and during the events he made mention of you, and a certain concern you are having with some photos you have of a U-boat and your dogs.
"Is that right?" Troy replied, cursing his lack of foresight. Of course that fat fool at the police station would tell the Germans what Troy had shown them. Just his luck.
May I see the photos of your U-boat, please? Perhaps I can explain its intention.
Their intentions were pretty clear when the soldiers on board tried to shoot me. You should tell your Führer to get better men for his Kriegsmarine. Most couldn't hit a barn if it were 5 feet in front of their faces. Hostetter didn't respond to that, but simply sighed.
In any case, may I see the photos?
Sorry, but I can't show you. Part of an ongoing case and all. Besides, I don't need you warning your people about what I've dug up. Mr. Hostetter smiled at this, but there was a cold, calculating snarl behind his eyes that made Troy on edge.
I believe you are being most paranoid, Herr Troy, he chuckled. The Third Reich's U-boats only stop off around here to refuel and to resupply. If the crew shot at you, it was likely out of fear or misunderstanding. Again, if you show me the ship images, I can have the crew properly disciplined.
Well, that'll be hard. I killed most of them, Troy responded coldly. This news brought a sense of disdain to Hostetter's face, but not surprise. He knew they were dead. He'd probably organized the cleanup. All he wanted was to know if Troy could identify the ship. He needed to know if he'd found out the ship's function and purpose. No matter what, the poker face had to hold.
Herr Troy, the German hissed, losing some of his nicety. The last thing our country wants is to get caught up in a war with yours.
Nah, just the rest of Europe, right? The point being, Hostetter sneered,
is that we have no reason to threaten your soil. Why not let these things be what they are? You saw a U-boat. You got into a fight with the crew. We will be more careful with our ships from now on. There's no need for...
Please, don't insult both of us by saying we should bury the hatchet, Troy snapped. I didn't start this fight. Your Führer did what he authorized with a Nazi-crafted dock in our harbor. Let's try talking to each other like honest men for a moment, shall we? Troy stood up and marched closer to Hostetter. Why don't you tell me what you goose-stepping sons of bitches are planning, and I'll make sure it stops with or without your approval. Hostetter, despite his plumper and seemingly more fragile stature, didn't budge, and rather just stared at James dryly. As the air between them dripped with a dangerous edge, he pulled out a bound wallet from his coat.
You are an investigator, yeah? He asked curtly. You work for pay. So how much is your going rate?
Are you seriously offering to pay me?
No. I'm offering to triple your rate, to let this all go away. The Third Reich doesn't need a scandal with the United States. If you will not back down for the sake of peace, then maybe money will help you recognize the need for stability.
Why don't you take that check you're about to sign and wipe your ass with it? Troy offered darkly. I don't take bribes from you people, and the fact that you're so desperate to bribe me shows me you really are up to something. Guess what, Gestapo? I'm just getting started. I'm gonna bust whatever it is you're doing wide open, and I sure as hell hope you're there to watch me do it. And for the first time since they started talking, the smile on Hostetter's face felt genuine. It was just as cruel and cold as before, but now it was a real smile and not a forced show.
Yeah, maybe I will be. Maybe. But will the lovely Fraulein Frost?
If looks could kill, Hostetter would have been struck dead in an instant. Troy moved like a lightning bolt and was up and towering over Hostetter with a trembling but furious voice. What the hell are you talking about? What have you done with her?
Nothing, Herr Troy, nothing. And it will stay that way, I assure you. So long as you and she resume your inspecting elsewhere, he replied coldly. It is such a shame for a lovely Fraulein to be caught up in matters of war, yeah? I know you and I would both hope to avoid such unpleasantries that war can bring on such a delicate creature like her.
Keep your filthy hands off her. She is not part of this.
But she is, Hostetter laughed at the mock sadness in his voice. Ah, Herr Troy, the more you push into this needless affair, the more needless lives you drag in with you. If you insist on waging meaningless war with us, then she must indeed be brought along as well. This is why I again urge you to step away from this before more needless lives are affected.
Troy felt a cold weight fall upon his shoulders, and it was melting through his clothes into his skin and right down his spine. They knew. They knew about his relationship with Elizabeth, and that meant even her apartment wasn't safe anymore. And neither was she.
I think it would be prudent and wise to let all things be as they are. You leave this nasty affair alone and no one has to be dragged into it, yeah? Hostetter chuckled. We can all be friends. Yeah, Herr Troy? I don't tend to make friends with vipers, but you do make alliances with sewer rats and street whores, Hostetter challenged, a bite of venom in his tongue. Normally, Troy would have risen to the bait of him calling Frost a common whore, but he knew better than to raise his fists, not when there was so much riding on his next few movements. I can see that this conversation is at an end, but I trust you will make the right decision, Herr Troy. You strike me as a decent man, if not an overly self-righteous one. And you strike me as every bit the kind of man I expected you goose-steppers to be. Auf Wiedersehen. Without another word, Hostetter turned on his heels and walked out. No sooner had the door clicked shut behind him than Troy scrambled uncharacteristically quickly for his phone to call Elizabeth. She had to be warned. Elizabeth! He shouted once the line connected. James, what's wrong? You sound upset. The Germans know. They know about you. It's not safe at your apartment right now. A goose-stepping moron just told me to back off the case or you'll be a liability. There was a long intake of breath, but then a slow and understanding sigh. Frost, hello? What are you doing? Just collecting myself. I kind of knew this might happen. Look, stay at the office for tonight. We'll stay here and... I'm sorry, James, but I can't do that. Why not? Pack a bag and it's not like that, Troy. I got my old job back at the nightclub. I'm going tonight to sing and get my feet back in the door. James and Troy blinked in shock. It was rare that Troy was left speechless, but now he'd been rendered dumb by this news. Okay, before you lose your temper, which I know you will, I made this choice myself. If the Nazis actually planted gas bombs in the city without anyone noticing, then they had to do it through the underground or the local mob. A lot of those punks come into the nightclub to get drunk. Maybe I can use that to listen and get some information. You'd be surprised how much bragging these guys do just to get their arms around a woman. Troy's first instinct was to chastise Elizabeth for willingly letting strange men hit on her just for some information, but then stopped himself, as it wasn't relevant to his immediate concerns, and quite frankly, he'd never minded Frost using her feminine wiles to woo men into giving up information before. She wasn't a whore, but she was a definite vixen. Rather, he had far more pressing problems right now. Okay, look, Elizabeth, regardless, you can't do this right now. The Germans likely already know about your job and will find you there. Just say you're sick tonight or something. James, I told you that I'm not letting you do this alone. I might not be a gunslinger like you, but I know my way around the gin joints and bars in this city. If you want to get to the underground, this is our best shot. Now I'm getting ready to leave now. I'll catch up with you tomorrow morning for breakfast. How about it, Vesuvio's? Elizabeth, I'm begging you not to do this. These guys are seriously dangerous. I know, she replied firmly. But I can't just hide at home and hope you'll protect me when I know I could be helpful. I'll see you tomorrow, James. Good night. Frost hung up before Troy could argue, and he slammed the phone down in anger. That woman's gonna get herself killed, he snapped, grabbing his coat and rushing out the door to get to her apartment. He locked things up swiftly and nearly dropped his keys as his fingers were jittering with fear. If that Gestapo got to her before he did, he didn't want to think about what they'd do to her.